Hello from me, David Foster. Good to have your company. When a disease attacks your lungs, breathing in dirty air certainly isn't going to help. So how much will this global pandemic propel us to a cleaner world? And if you have to live with air pollution, what is it doing to your chances of surviving COVID-19? This is Roundtable. And it's not just the lungs in scientific circles. They're talking about how dirty air can allow the bug to get to other parts of the body with very worrying results.
With the global coronavirus death toll above 500,000, experts are looking more closely at the factors contributing to the spread of the disease. A key question: why do some regions have higher numbers of cases and deaths than others? According to professors from Harvard University's School of Public Health, people with COVID-19 who live in US regions with high levels of air pollution are more likely to die from the disease than people who live in less polluted areas. The study suggests that living in a county with high levels of fine particulate pollution can increase the risk of death by 8% for coronavirus patients. And higher pollution levels have been shown to cause higher numbers of hospitalizations. So what can be done about the impact of air pollution as the pandemic continues?
Well, I'm very pleased to say that joining us at the round table, albeit not physically, we have Roy Harrison, who's a professor of environmental health at the University of Birmingham. We say hello to Anna Hansell, professor in environmental epidemiology at the University of Leicester, and we welcome back Gisli Jenkins, professor at the National Institute for Health Research, who's also joint editor-in-chief of the respiratory journal Thorax. We are discussing air pollution. Roy, let me ask you first of all, is there any evidence that there is a direct link between bad quality air and your chances of surviving COVID-19?
None that I would regard as being well proven at the moment. We know very well that breathing poor quality air can shorten your life. It can exacerbate respiratory diseases and heart diseases. And it seems likely that a condition like COVID, which attacks the lungs, might well affect people living in more polluted areas than it does others. But at the moment, the research is pretty inconclusive in my view.
But it could well be a contributory factor, bearing in mind that poor quality air often occurs in socially, economically deprived areas where poor people live. They have poor access to health care, etc., etc.
Well, this is exactly the problem. What we do know, I think, with some certainty, is that people with a high level of deprivation are more likely to die from COVID infection than others. I don't think we know whether they're more likely to be infected, but certainly they represent a bigger proportion of the death statistics than they do of the population as a whole. And they do, as you say, tend to live in the more polluted areas. And it really is tricky to disentangle those two effects. So while it seems probable that the air pollution is contributing to the severity of the COVID and the mortality, we don't know that with any certainty because it is so correlated with socioeconomic status and deprivation.
The trouble is, Anna, we just don't know, do we?
Well, I think we're starting to build up a picture. So we started saying we've seen high levels of COVID-19 mortality in areas where air pollution is high. And then we've had two very detailed studies looking at US counties, which have suggested there is an association between air pollution levels and COVID-19 mortality, but also severity. And they're what we call hypothesis generating studies, but they are making us sort of sit up and taking a good look at this and saying we need some more studies, particularly at individual level, so we can take account of people's lifestyle factors and smoking, as well as all the other factors that Roy was talking about, which is deprivation, people from minority ethnic groups, for example, and people with lots of comorbidities that tend to predispose to having more severe disease.
You see, Gisli, it might seem a bit of a no-brainer to a lot of people. I mean, you're an expert in lung disease. If you breathe in something that's going to damage your lungs, then your chances of being damaged further by a different element are increased.
Well, I think that there's a lot of truth to that. I think there's two issues. One is the long-term effects of pollution. And we know that 20 years worth of exposure to pollutants will increase your risk of chronic lung diseases such as COPD and idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. But that's not going to have a direct effect on getting infected with COVID right now. You may get worse COVID. In fact, you do get worse COVID if you have an underlying COPD or IPF co-diagnosis. And then there's the question,
that's a chronic pulmonary disease, is it?
Pardon?
CPD. Chronic pulmonary disease?
Chronic obstructive pulmonary disease,
okay.
Yeah. So COPD, one of the biggest killers in the UK. And you're more likely to die of COVID if you have COPD. And that's primarily due to smoking, but pollution plays a role as well. And then there's a well-known effect of pollution on immune cell function. So we know that over many years that pollution affects the function of macrophages, for example, which are the sentinel cell that protects you against invaders such as flu, coronavirus, etc., etc. And that will be altered. How precisely, we don't know, but that will be altered by pollution.
Anna, you wanted to ask Gisli a question. Now's your chance.
It's really about the mechanisms. The thing that's worrying me about the American studies is that they're showing much higher associations with the air pollution and COVID-19 mortality than we've seen in all-cause mortality before the pandemic. And one of the possibilities is that there's not only this long-term effect that Gisli's just described, but there might be some short-term effects of air pollution. And one of the hypotheses that's been put forward is that air pollution is increasing the numbers of receptors in the lung, the ACE2 receptors that the coronavirus latches onto. So it'd be really good to hear Gisli's opinion on that theory.
Do you want to think about it or come in now?
I've spent a long time thinking about this because one of the perplexing things to me is that although ACE2 is clearly the receptor used by SARS-CoV-2 to get into the body and to set up the infection, it's really not clear at all that the extensive lung disease that you get in association with COVID is primarily due to infection of the epithelial cells through ACE2. So it could be through another receptor, or it could be an exaggerated immune response. And in fact, that's one of the ways by which pollution may mediate its effects, rather than by regulating the receptor up and down, by altering the response of the macrophage to produce much more damaging cytokines and growth factors which attack the lung because they've been primed by breathing in pollution.
Well, fascinating. I would like to bring Roy back into the discussion here and talk about how far we've come in cleaning up cities. Let's talk about the UK, for example. Going back to the 1940s, 1950s, there were smog-related, what they called pea supers, where coal burning and fog itself trapped pollutants under a cloud over London. A lot of people died then. We've had an awful lot of diesel fumes. Are things getting better now? In other words, if COVID had arrived 20 years ago, 40 years ago, 60 years ago, would it have been a lot worse because of the pollution then?
Well, assuming that the effects of COVID are exacerbated by air pollution, they would have been hugely worse then, absolutely so, because we have cleaned up the air a very great deal since the 50s and 60s. So levels of particles in the air, for example, are only probably a fifth of what they were in those days, or possibly even lower. We've cleaned up sulfur dioxide very effectively, but we've tended to create a nitrogen dioxide problem. And that's largely been a problem attributable to diesel traffic, and it's the huge growth in light-duty diesels that's been very substantially responsible for that. Now, one of these US COVID studies is attributing the effects to nitrogen dioxide exposure. And that would be an interesting one. But from an epidemiological point of view, it's very difficult to separate the effects of breathing particles from those of nitrogen dioxide. They're so strongly correlated in the atmosphere that the studies really confuse them and find it very difficult to pick them apart. But we weren't actually measuring nitrogen dioxide on a routine basis in the days of the London smogs, but I suspect that is a pollutant that's got worse, and it's one we're only now beginning to get under control.
You said at the beginning of the programme there was no evidence that it necessarily exacerbated the effects of COVID-19. You've just said, well, you know, assuming that it does. I detect a certain scepticism. Would I be right if I said that?
Well, I'm sceptical until I've seen papers that I think are free of residual confounding in terms of the epidemiology, meaning that
You mean by that
they
bias?
have allowed all of the other factors that are driving the disease. And I don't think they are doing very well at the moment.
Are people skewing their opinions?
I don't think anyone's out to sell us a story. I think they're doing their best, but we have a lot to learn. I mean, this is a new disease. We really don't understand the risk factors terribly well. Some of these studies are showing a big, strong relationship to obesity. And my understanding is from the Public Health England report that obesity seems to be a major risk factor. But actually, some of the studies that have looked at air pollution have controlled for obesity and have said, well, it's not actually important. Well, I find that very doubtful.
Anna, you were shaking your head, now you're smiling. Go on.
That's what Roy does to me sometimes. We go backwards and forwards on this. It's not bias in terms of people have biased views. It's a scientific term. So we're talking about the ways in which the studies are conducted.
And I wouldn't suggest otherwise.
Of course. But we've got some issues that the areas with high air pollution tend to be the ones where you get poorer people living, they have more health conditions, they have higher levels of obesity and various other risk factors that mean they're much more likely to have adverse health effects from whatever you throw at them. So it's very difficult to disentangle all of those factors. So that's where we might refer to bias or confounding that affecting the results and the associations that we see.
You care to
I think Roy's answering from a different point of view from me, because my view is that there are so many studies now that show associations between air pollution and almost every other disease that COVID-19 would be extremely unusual if we didn't see some sort of link. But I think that the question is, how large is that link? Is it large enough for us to change what we do on a public health basis due to the air pollution levels, and what's driving it? So that's part of the discussions, the questions I was asking Gisli, because that's quite important about how you think about tackling it.
Okay, does anybody want to reply to that, or shall I go on to the facts and figures I have here that I would like explaining? All right, I'll go on. How about this? Harvard University School of Public Health, T.H. Chan School of Public Health. There's a correlation between air pollution and COVID-19 deaths. A rise of just 1 microgram per cubic meter corresponds to an increase of 15% in COVID-19 deaths. I tried my hardest, but I couldn't find out in terms of cars or power stations or whatever, what 1 microgram per cubic meter actually meant. Is it one fewer car on the road? Is it one less kettle switched on that fires up the the coal reactor or whatever? I don't know. Could we deal with that quite easily?
Well, shall I have a go at that one? In London, we typically see a concentration of PM2.5, which is the kind of particles they're talking about, of somewhere around 12, maybe 15 micrograms per cubic meter. WHO currently recommends we should have less than 10 as a long-term average. And I mean, places like rural Worcestershire, where I'm sitting at the moment, generally does have less than 10. Now, it's not all down to road traffic. this is a big fallacy. The particles are not. The nitrogen dioxide largely is, but the particles are not. And in fact, one of the things that happened after lockdown in London was the nitrogen dioxide concentrations fell hugely, but the PM2.5, the particle concentrations, actually went up in London.
Where do they come from?
Well, at that time, they were coming largely from mainland Europe. And they're actually being formed in the atmosphere by atmospheric chemical reactions of trace gases like sulfur dioxide and nitrogen dioxide and organic compounds that are converted to particles in the atmosphere, and they travel over very long distances.
Do they come particularly from heavily industrialized areas?
Yes, I think there's a big contribution from heavily industrialized areas. Parts of Eastern Europe that still burn a lot of coal have a lot of sulfur dioxide emissions. They're responsible for quite a lot. I suspect that parts of Germany, like the Ruhr, which is still heavily industrialized, are responsible for a lot of these compounds from which the particles
How
are
extraordinary. So it's not the cars in London. It could be somebody burning something in Lithuania or wherever. I'm sort of wondering, Gisli, therefore, if it's just something we have to live with. It's nothing we can do about it.
No, I would disagree. I think there's two things. One is, just because it isn't happening here doesn't mean we can't lobby for everybody to try and make the air cleaner. There is little doubt that in a global world, global production of stuff that's bad for your lungs needs a global response. So I think we have to work together as an international community to deal with that.
And therefore, sorry, carry on.
Fundamentally, pollution leads to long-term problems. Clearly, there's an immediate crisis with COVID, but actually, the bigger crisis may well be 20 years down the line when endless pollutants cause chronic lung disease on top of COVID.
Anna, you split your days in normal times between London and Leicester. You're in London at the moment. What I want to ask you is, have you noticed a major change in air quality? And given what Roy's just said about the fact it could be somebody firing up their boiler in the Ukraine and it blowing this way, taking a few cars off the road in the capital of the United Kingdom appears to have made no difference whatsoever.
Oh, it did make a difference. The NO2 levels definitely fell, and overall, if you average it out, the PM levels did fall as well. The particulate matter levels did fall, but we had that wonderful weather over Easter, which was still and sunny, and it was just the air was just trapped there, so the particles to some extent were just building up. But you did notice that the air was cleaner. I can't say it's definitely cleaner in Leicester than in London, because Leicester also has air quality problems in the centre of the city, and snarled up traffic sitting in traffic jams like any other city. So I think it's a myth that London has all the air pollution. There are air pollution problems in the centre of most cities, I think, in the UK. And I think there's another myth that the particulates that are coming out of cars are not important. They are important. They might be more important in terms of the toxicity. And certainly one of the studies that I've been involved with has been looking at air pollution in children's lungs and development. And we've found higher adverse effects with the road transport components of particulates than we have with other sources of particulates. And that's an area that I think we need to do more work on, because not every particulate is equal.
Yeah. Are we straying off the subject here? I mean, I think we've established that anything you breathe in that's not very nice is going to do you some degree of harm. We can't prove that it's COVID-19 that's getting worse because of this, but we're talking about air pollution being bad. I think we haven't strayed off the subject. I think we've actually sort of taken it and found a reason to talk about Roy and Anna's area of expertise, and Gisli can contribute to that. So, Roy, I'm suggesting that taking 20% of the cars off the road in London is not going to make a great deal of difference. If you suggest that it's not the particles produced by the cars, except for diesels, that are causing lung damage.
Well, clearly, taking a lot of cars off the road during the lockdown actually didn't have a big effect anywhere in the country. London and parts of the southeast were a little different from most of the country in that the concentrations actually increased during the lockdown. But no, traffic isn't the answer, although the point that Anna raises about the fact that particles from traffic might be more toxic than the same weight of particles from another source, that is an issue that very much needs investigation, where at the moment we're still lacking definitive knowledge on that, and we hope to answer those sorts of questions with research in the next few years. That's an important issue.
To mix my metaphors and my colours, Gisli or Anna, is the green cycling revolution a red herring then?
But cycling's got other public health benefits. It's not just the air quality. It's actually getting people to do more exercise, and that's hugely helpful.
Gisli, go on.
Yeah, no, I mean, cycling is got so many benefits, and actually getting pollution off the road, getting cars off the road will help. We may not have a huge amount of evidence that during lockdown it made a big difference, but it's hard to believe that the pollution from cars in city centres in rush hour is not causing some health problems.
Well, no, but what about if you're on your bicycle as opposed to in a relatively comfortable air-conditioned car where the air can be clean to some extent, and you're on a bicycle breathing in those car fumes, even if there are half as many cars as there were a month before, it's going to be worse for you than sitting back in your saloon, isn't it?
Well, apparently not. There are data, and my colleagues will tell me if these data are correct, that actually the air that you get inside your car is dirtier because it comes filtered through the engine.
Go on, you're nodding.
We've done that study in Leicester as well, and you can just get the air recirculating inside, but even so, you don't always cycle down the busy road. If you've got a bike, you can go through the park and take a different route.
Okay.
Well,
carry on.
That have been done that have considered both the health benefits of cycling from the exercise and the disbenefits from breathing the polluted air, allowing for the fact that people are generally breathing a bit harder when they're pedaling a bike, still show that the cycling is beneficial for health on a net basis. So we should be encouraging it, that's for sure.
Are we heading, we've only got a couple of minutes left, so quick ones from each one of you. Are we heading for a cleaner, better, healthier world for our lungs?
Absolutely, but we're not going fast enough.
Show us that again, Anna.
It was a fingers crossed. Don't forget, don't forget the cleaner air you were breathing during lockdown.
You applaud what's being trumpeted in this country.
What do you mean in terms of
more cycle lanes outside here that make it longer journey times for buses? Therefore, they're pumping out even more of what it is they pump out. So I don't know which is better.
We need to have a rethink of the whole way in which we move ourselves around the world. So we picked a quite carbon polluting and nitrogen dioxide emitting, particle emitting ways of getting around. And we need to rethink that. And that's one of the positive things that could come out of this current awful situation.
Yeah. Why does anybody need a car in London? That's another programme, isn't it? Get them all off the road, put electric buses out there, we'll all be fine. And loads of cyclists who end up sort of with head injuries, but that's a different programme. Roy, what do you think about this? Do you think it's basically sort of a fig leaf, if you like, saying we're going to have more cycle lanes, saying we're going to encourage people to walk to work, unless you do something much bigger?
I do think you need a much more radical policy than just pushing out the odd cycle lane here and there. As Anna says, we really do have to look very seriously about how we move ourselves around particularly in cities, but internationally as well, whether we're doing things in the most effective way in terms of air pollution and health and so on. There's a lot of thinking needs to be done. And I suspect there's just a lot of tokenism at the moment.
And Gisli, as a lung specialist, are you pleased that this debate is taking place? Because perhaps until now, it has been one of the invisible diseases, if you like, lung disease, because people, they're not aware of what causes it all of the time.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. I think it's important that people realise that lung disease is not just smoking, and I think that this highlights that. Active travel, so walking and cycling, have undoubted benefits beyond just removing yourself from a polluting car. All kinds of extra benefits, mental health benefits, physical health benefits.
Indeed, but I suppose it depends where you walk. Thank you each and every one of you. We have got to the end of this programme. Roy, Anna, Gisli, for joining us on a number of occasions. We thank you very much indeed. Great to have your thoughts, you two from Worcester and from London, and thank you very much wherever you happen to be for watching this edition of Roundtable. We'll be back with another episode very soon. I'd love it if you could join us for that. From me, David Foster, and the team. Goodbye for now.